Welcome everyone to the event this evening. Thanks for coming along. So Melissa's already introduced Attorney General Sessions. As everyone will no doubt know, he was Attorney General under Donald Trump, previously a four-term Senator for Alabama, the Alabama Attorney General, and before that an attorney in Alabama. We've also got David Dusenbury, who's a recently arrived visiting fellow at the Danube Institute, and he's a historian of ideas with the book out on Pontius Pilate. We also have Professor Jeff Kaplan, I should say, who's a notable specialist on millenarian religious movements and terrorism, and distinguishing fellow at the Danube Institute. And finally, Tamás Orbán, who's a geopolitical specialist and a researcher at the Danube Institute. So I've got a few questions just to start a conversation, and hopefully it can be fairly free rein within that. And if we have time at the end, hopefully we will. Hopefully we can open it up to questions from all of you. So to begin with, the theme today is the US and the current crisis, which is quite a general theme in some ways. And I think there are many forms of crisis, obviously, in certainly Western culture today. We could certainly say we live in interesting times, even if a lot of the excitement seems to be playing out more on social media than in the real world, with some exceptions. But we talk about climate crises, and the left will talk about social justice crises. On the right, there are different sorts of crises that are identified. And I think from some people in the middle, they'll say the real crisis is political polarity. It's the fact that things are becoming increasingly tribal. But I think at the moment, there's an obvious crisis that we've been talking about in recent weeks, which is the Afghan crisis. And I think it's possible actually through a discussion or entry point through that crisis to talk about some of these broader challenges that's being faced in the West at the moment. And I want to begin just with a quick point of my own, or an observation that hopefully will be a jump-off point for a discussion of Afghanistan, leading to a general discussion of the state of Western culture at the moment. And in the last month, we've read a lot about the parallels. I think we've all encountered these parallels being drawn between falling people from planes above Kabul and people falling from the two towers. But I have to say that when I saw that footage, I drew a slightly different parallel, which is it made me think of something else that fell from a plane, the little boy bomb that fell over Hiroshima in August 1945. And the reason I thought of this is because in some ways, the dropping of that bomb was the literal starting gun for an era of American cultural, political, economic, and indeed moral hegemony around the world over the past 75 years, almost a full 80-year seculum of Pax Americana. And when I saw those falling men a month ago, I thought of two things: that it seemed to almost symbolize a loss of American moral authority in the world, but also an emphatic demonstration that maybe it doesn't have the sort of actual authority and power that sometimes we assume it has over the last 80 years. And those scenes of the falling men were quite apocalyptic, but it's important, I think, to remember the word apocalypse has two meanings. There is cataclysm, but there's also the revelation of what has previously been concealed. And so from this, I'd like to pose the question that while we know that the Afghan crisis is a cataclysm for the Afghans, does it also reveal something perhaps previously concealed, albeit in plain sight, about the West itself? Does it reveal a crisis for the West that goes beyond simply a foreign policy challenge or a strategic challenge? And does it rather mark the end of the Age of America in a similar way that the Suez Crisis in 1956 was the symbolic, if not actual, end of the British Empire? And to begin, I'd pose the question to Jeff initially.
Is that all you have?
Sessions, Jeff Sessions.
Well, thank you. It's great to be in Budapest. We've had, my wife and I have had just a wonderful visit. We'll have a couple of more days and not had a more relaxing time, and the weather's been fantastic and everybody's super, and we've gained 10 pounds and eaten delightfully and not worried one bit about it, frankly. So it's been good. And Melissa is a good Alabamian, and her husband John, I've known him for many years, and he's a great, brilliant mind of wisdom and experience and judgment that's been, I'm sure, a blessing to Hungary. So, power in the United States. Well, the United States remains the premier military power in the world without any doubt if you don't use atom bombs. You know, if we use atom bombs, I don't know what you would say about that. It's unthinkable that we would use nuclear weapons. So the United States is capable of projecting power to any corner of the world. It has courageous men and women who fight wounded or whatever. They've proven time and again that you do not want to go to war against the United States soldiers. And I'm so proud of that. They are trained on on great technology. They know how to use it and to apply it in practical ways. But in the case of all of life, I guess there are limits to that kind of power. And just because you can defeat a organized force in Afghanistan, of all, you know, and you can move your helicopters and aircraft and build a magnificent military aircraft and landing field and tanks and machine guns and missiles from drones that can blow up an automobile, doesn't mean that this is the right thing to do, or it can be sustainable over time. I want you to mention our discussion you had with Rory Stewart, the great English thinker and writer and candidate. I'd met him a couple of times and I read his book, Places in Between, about Afghanistan. But some of this is just being wise in the use of power. A lot of people think, and I supported President Bush in his activities, but so we in short order achieved what we desired to achieve. And then at some point there was a vision that we could transform Afghanistan, and that the women would be educated and they would change so many of their habits, and they'd watch TV and pornography and all be free, right? I mean, that's what somehow we thought this was going to be a great thing. And then we're going to fix Iraq too while we were at it. And we supported that. But I'm not sure there was enough consultation with people of wisdom before we made that decision. And I'm not sure we carefully thought out what the future might be. So I think Rory Stewart said what I believe is that humility is a good quality for great power, and we need to be more careful and think long term about whether the United States should deploy its power and under what circumstances it should, and we should evaluate what happened. The military would say to us repeatedly, or not repeatedly, well, they did repeatedly. Basically, it was a talking point of the United States, President Bush and the military, that we stayed in Germany for 30 years, we stayed in Japan for 30 years, we stayed in South Korea for 30 years, and to which I told one general, well, I got to tell you, Germany, Japan, and South Korea are not Afghanistan. This is you have to think, use judgment. This not so they were receptive to our help. They were receptive to a democratic form of government. We assisted them, and it turned out to be wonderful for the world. Those three nations are positive players in the world to a remarkable degree, and the United States are very proud of it. But it's not true everywhere, in every corner of the world, that you can do that. So I would say that humility is something we need to do. And I don't know that it's a withdrawal from world leadership or interest by the United States to stop butting your head against the wall. You know, if you're trying to do something that's not working and you stop, that doesn't mean that you're stupid. Maybe you're smart to stop. And so how people will interpret this, I'm a little worried because I hear people question, what does this mean about the United States? Are you no longer going to be interested in the world's future? I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I'm not sure where President Biden would be. I think President Trump would be that if somebody threatened us and our allies and justifies the situation, we will deploy power as we have in the past. But it better be clear, because he didn't want to go to war. I'm telling you, whatever else you think about President Trump, he did not like to go to war. This is an instinct of his. He wastes money. He'd like to spend money on something else, you know. And how much money is this? He wants to know how many $1 trillion we spent on this war, what we could have done with $2 trillion. So anyway, that's kind of where I am. I believe the United States will bounce back. I don't know its decision to extricate itself from Iraq inartfully, improperly, unwisely handled, it appears. At least that's a consensus of the American public. But I don't think that means that we'll not deploy our power. And with regard to China, I think we'll see a very aggressive trade battle, economic battle, it looks like, for years to come there, and hopefully it won't become a shooting conflict through surrogates or otherwise.
Thank you.
Did I answer that? Oh, no?
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's interesting you mentioned Rory Stewart, because Rory Stewart famously had a single line about Afghanistan. He's the former International Development Secretary for the UK, and he said that ought does not imply can. That just because you think you ought to do something, it doesn't mean you can. And that's, I think, where the sense of the need for humility.
Yeah, and I've said good intentions is not enough, particularly for a great power.
Precisely.
It needs to be wisdom, too.
So from Jeff Sessions to Jeff Kaplan. So on the question of, do you think that the Afghan crisis can be seen beyond simply a foreign policy strategic challenge? Do you think it also potentially could be seen to mark the age of America, in a sense, that we've lived under since the end of the Second World War?
Well, it's a difficult question. I agree with Mr. Sessions that the American military power is preeminent. American soldiers well trained, and given a mission that can be accomplished, they will accomplish it. Our problem in the post-Korean era, though, is that we're giving them a grand mission without a strategy, without terminal goals, without an exit strategy. We're going into a place like Afghanistan that I've been several times in various points in its history. It's deeply tribalized. We never really understood the tribal system. And so we go into foreign conflicts assuming two things. One, they are just like us. And no, they're not. In fact, they have their own history, their own culture. Or they want to be just like us. And to a degree, that has proven true with educated elites. But if you're looking at a deeply tribalized system, it simply is not true at all. They've been through a lot, and they have weathered it through their own systems, their own way of doing things. And so my question to Mr. Sessions really would be, in the future, certainly America isn't going to retrench. We will continue to deploy if our interests are at stake. But do you think that there's a growing maturity in the American strategic community, whereby we say, okay, we are going in for this. We have a limited set of goals. Once those goals are met, we have an exit strategy to get out. And we're able to interact with cultures as they are, not as we would like them to be.
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. I think you'll have, whether it's I think you'll have that kind of philosophy whether it is appropriate in some new event or not. You know, we're famous for fighting the last war. And sometimes we learn that lesson, but it doesn't apply to the next war. But yes, I think that'll be the tendency of the United States to, let's say, the conventional wisdom is that we could have sent in troops and destroyed bin Laden and his camp in Afghanistan and got on the plane and left. And fewer people would have died, and probably Afghanistan would have advanced about as much as it has now. I don't know about that, but so did that answer?
Or perhaps go in a different way at a different time.
Yeah.
After the Russians left, they had a vicious civil war, and the Americans simply cut and run. We didn't get involved at all. And there was a way that we could have exerted influence with a minimum or very little military power, with economic aid.
You mean right after the
Russians
withdrew?
Because the civil war that they had are what led to the Taliban. The Taliban were in some ways thought of by Afghans as the cure to the civil war, as a non-tribal entity. So sometimes, in terms of policy, if we look more carefully and time what we're doing, not have a knee-jerk reaction military, where we have so many other levers of power.
I think that's wise comment, wise insight.
So bringing the question over to you, David, have you got any thoughts on the idea or the argument, or what are your thoughts on the idea that what we're seeing in Afghanistan is an end of an era, in a sense? Do you think that's a plausible position, or not?
I mean, it certainly strikes me as plausible, arguable. But I suppose my more focused thought is that there seem to be certain parallels. You drew the parallel between the little boy and the falling man, and there seem to be certain parallels between what we saw much more recently in the mid-2010s, migration crisis in Europe, which I think was precipitated by a number of actions by Western powers, calculated inactions by Western powers, and so on and so forth. And it seems that we haven't learned not only, let's say, what the effects on the Afghan nation and the region will be by our actions and inactions, but it seems to me that the withdrawal demonstrates that the United States has still not learned what the predictable effects of the withdrawal will be on their allies, such as Europe. I mean, it seems uncontroversial to suggest that migration flows will be heightened and intensified as a result of the collapse of the Afghan government. So I suppose, I mean, it's a slightly different point, but it seems to me that it reveals, getting back to the two senses of apocalypse, it reveals what I see as a profound weakness in American strategic thinking.
Thank you.
Well, I'll just say the Europeans did support Afghanistan somewhat reluctantly, but they did, with less supportive in Iraq. But we had great countries in Europe that wouldn't even allow their soldiers to carry loaded guns and not pull the trigger. I mean, our soldiers were out there weeks at a time,
Afghan soldiers did the same.
mountains and stuff, fighting tenaciously. So we carried that load, there's no doubt about that, but Europeans did support, and I think they deserve respectful, their views need respectful hearing now, and probably should have been listened to more carefully at the beginning.
Thank you. And Tamás, so you're a geopolitical specialist.
Yeah.
So I suppose, I mean, you can answer it how you like, but actually the question I have for you, if you're interested in answering it, is from particularly a Hungarian perspective, how do you think what's happening in Afghanistan and this crisis that we're seeing changes the geopolitical calculus of the region or even the world, and how do you see that impacting Europe?
Well, from Hungarian perspective, it's not so different than other European or Central European perspectives. mainly what I see and what I'd like to add to the others before me is that this withdrawal doesn't, I don't think it signals the weakening of American strategic thinking. Maybe it just signals that suddenly we're not in the Cold War anymore. There are multiple, capable pieces on this grand chessboard of our world. And when it's about Pax Americana, I think that I tend to agree with the line of thinking of Immanuel Wallerstein, who said that Pax Americana ended on January the 1st, 1991, as soon as the Soviet Union ended. Yeah. Because the only reason America really could project its power was that it had a clear adversary. It had something to go against it. And as soon as the Soviet Union crumbled and fell, America was left without a very direct goal, and the bipolar world it had been operating in up until then had become a multipolar world with much more different interests, different approaches to things, and it doesn't mean that Americans' hegemony ended overnight. No, it doesn't, and nor did anybody else stepped in their place. It means that in 1991 we started a so-called transitional period, and in which this Pax Americana, or whatever you might call it, started to slowly, steadily erode, and other players, other actors started to gain more and more power. So it's like America is going down and other players are coming up, and it's a world where we are heading into a world where you cannot really single out the biggest dog in the yard, so to speak. But we have a couple of dogs and they all fight for the same bone. And with this withdrawal, I think it's perfectly fits in this picture of Wallerstein, because as America lost Afghanistan, geostrategically it was China, obviously, who has won the most out of it.
Well, that's very interesting, actually. Maybe to direct a question to Jeff out of that from the American perspective, how do you see the Afghan crisis affecting the balance of power, or indeed the imbalance of power with China?
Well, it does look like China will seek to gain advantage, and they probably are well positioned to do so, but you never know how those things might play out in the long run. I do think Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Libya, and those were matters that dealt with radical Islam and attacks on the West. So we did succeed in stopping that for 20 years, in large part. I think we convinced that world that the United States has the capability to respond, and that the world won't accept it. I think the world was supportive also. So I think the world was willing to, world was supportive. So I think the terrorism has taken a setback, but can it reconstitute? I assume it can. So I think people are worried about what will happen in the future with regard to terrorism, and will Afghanistan be a base? If you remember, Mullah Omar would not take action against bin Laden, who had set up a base in Afghanistan. And the general principle, at least I believe, the general principle of law is if a nation will not stop outlaw activity within their own nation, then you have, and it threatens you, then you have a right to use power to neutralize that threat, even though it might violate the borders. So that's really what started this thing. And so we don't know now whether, I mean, some of you may have a better judgment than I about the ability of ISIS to reconstitute itself, create a base, and begin to threaten the Western world again.
That's actually quite a good pivot point to the second question, but does anyone else have any responses or comments on anyone? No? Okay, so please.
I perhaps just should have said that this this fundamental weakness I was talking about, I think there was a respite during the Trump administration, and we saw much greater stability, it seemed to me, in at least the respects I was talking about in the European space in the region.
Well, I think the President Trump was pretty clear about his view. We'll protect the interests of the United States, and we're not looking to start a war. That was his basic, firm. You can write a book about it, or you can write it just about as succinctly as I just said it.
Yeah.
It was his philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very good, again, actually a very good pivot point to what I thought of my second question, which we've sort of touched on, but I think it might be worth digging into a bit more, which is that, so we've talked now about whether the Afghan crisis was an isolated one, or whether the problems actually reflect far more on the West than purely on what's happening in Afghanistan. But I think this raises an important point about how we in the West understand how the world works. I remember Alan Greenspan, after the financial crisis in 2008, said, the problem is our theory of how the world works was wrong. And I think that sort of sentiment, that admission, is one that maybe applies in this context. And at the moment we've seen, in the context of how quickly Afghanistan collapsed in the face of the Taliban, there'd be many people, I think including the Biden administration, have gone as far as just to blame the Afghans, say that they clearly don't care enough. But there are obviously other explanations and for why it collapsed so quickly. I mean, for instance, the one I've been thinking about the last week is an analogy with the language Esperanto. Esperanto was formed in the 1890s as an artificial language that was relatively simple grammatically, which could, in principle, become a universal language because of its simplicity. But of course, in reality, only about 100,000 people speak it, and they're all probably eccentrics. It's certainly not a universal language. So it's a language that was artificially created. It doesn't really apply anywhere. It's a language of nowhere, of no culture. And when I look at the attempt to intervene and develop a nation build in Afghanistan, my thought of it, it's political, economic, or cultural Esperanto. We're trying to make the Afghans speak culturally a language that doesn't really exist anywhere. And so is it any surprise that it just dissolved into smoke as soon as the people enforcing it disappeared? But that's just my idea then. The question out of this really is, why do these interventions and efforts fail? Is it indeed ever possible to impose cultural and political change from above on any particular community? In Hungary, I know there's some tension here, obviously, with regard to the sense of the EU imposing not just economic obligations, but also cultural and political ones as well. And certainly from a conservative perspective in Hungary, that's one of the big frustrations of the EU. And there's a very interesting, just to end this question really, to mention Rory Stewart again, I went back and we were talking about his book yesterday, and I went back and had a look at it. And my favorite quote from it is this. He said, "The West cannot hope to predict and control the intricate allegiances and loyalties of Afghan communities or the Afghan approach to government, but to acknowledge these limits and their implications would require not so much an anthropology of Afghanistan, but an anthropology of ourselves, and the sense of we need to reflect on what is it we're trying to achieve and why." And so from that, the question, why do you think these interventions do fail in places like Afghanistan? Is it ever possible to impose cultural and political change, in a sense, from above? Mr. Sessions.
Well, I think it was done in Japan and Germany, but it's not doable in Afghanistan. or at least very unrealistic to think that that could be accomplished. And you and I were talking about, did we fail? Did we make some mistake? Did we do something wrong? Or did we give the military an impossible task? Actually, that's what I told one of our top generals. He was saying we could have done this or we should have done that. To which I said, I'm not sure I'm afraid we asked our military to do something they couldn't achieve. And he said, Well, he didn't deny it because it was just too many ways it could go wrong. And in a war, if people are willing to fight tenaciously, we're never going to slaughter everybody in an area. And they can hide in the people. So if they're willing to fight and resist and aren't willing are not ready to develop into a democratic republic with a parliament, then we need to be realistic about it. Yeah, don't you? It's got to be realism. I formed a caucus. I say I formed it. We planned to form a caucus with 2 Democrats and me and another senator because I thought, and they agreed, that there was insufficient bipartisan foreign policy and too much of the activity was unrealistic. And well, pretty soon, one of them was a vice presidential nominee, and the election came on, and that all went away. But I do think that we ought to have an expanded caucus of realists in the U.S. Senate and the House, too, for that matter, and really study. What people don't know is that you don't get good information. You don't get it as a senator. Even the president's not getting it. So he asked the Secretary of Defense, well, what does he know about Afghanistan? Somewhere in the bowels of the Secretary of Defense's office, somebody does, but is that person ever getting up to the Secretary of Defense, and is he ever giving over to the President real knowledge of what this is all about? So I think we're stupid. Did George Bush know anything about, we're not stupid, but did George Bush really understand Afghanistan? Not really. Neither did Karl Rove, and neither did his team. They were getting information, but once any government starts making its decision, then unhappy comments are not welcomed. And so it sort of coalesces around the inclination of what people think the leader wants, and so they feed up information that tends to affirm the tendency of the president or any other country, prime ministers or what. I think that's so I think wisdom in getting it is critical. A great power can't blunder. It can't go into a war and not have a real clear estimate. Anything can go wrong, but he can't go into a war without having a very firm understanding of how it's going to end and how you're going to extract yourself, as you said, Dr. Kaplan. So I take a little mea culpa on that. I was concerned. I won't talk any longer. You got more people here to share.
Please continue.
Well, I'll just share this little story I shared with somebody recently. I'm on in the Senate gym right after we decided to invade, I guess, Afghanistan, and this old Brit came on C-SPAN. You know, C-SPAN was anybody in America could call in, and he got in, and nationwide TV, and because he's on the phone, and he says, "What's the matter with you people? This is stupid. You're going to regret this. We tried to control Afghanistan and we failed twice. The Russians tried and they failed, and you're going to fail too." My hair stood up. It still does stand up on my neck remembering that. I'm thinking, have we made a blunder? Well, about a week or two later, if you remember that scene of American forces, special forces on a hill with our allies, and the Taliban on the next hill, and these smart bombs were just killing them, devastating them, and the Afghans were jumping up and down and cheering. They never seen anything like that. Well, we're going to win this war. This is going to be great. So I'm thinking, whew, I guess it's going to be okay. But it really wasn't okay, you know. So what does that say? Does that answer? I mean, I just think how we think these things through, we've got to be very, very realistic, and we've got to somehow reach down, and maybe it's calling a Rory Stewart who walked across Afghanistan. I mean, people like that who actually know the area, know something about the military, know something about politics and history and anthropology and tribalism and whatever, and ask yourselves, how much good are we going to do? And how much damage might we do, not only to ourselves, but the people who live there? It's not this is not good to put a nation like Syria or Afghanistan or into a long, prolonged war that devastates the economy and causes turmoil. A lot of good things were done in Afghanistan. I think some of that I think women will remain in a better position. I think education is going to be in a better position. I think the connection with the outside world is going to be better. So I don't know. Maybe history will record it was worth it, but right now it looks like a pretty painful exercise.
Thank you. Jeff Kaplan. So do you have any thoughts on why you think, or even the response to Jeff, on why you think these efforts, certainly in the recent context of these efforts at nation building, why do you think they fail? And do you think it's possible ever to impose from above a cultural or political change on a culture?
I think Jeff had it exactly right. The worst form of decision making is when the decision maker is getting only data that he wants to hear. And that has been going on since the Johnson administration. You saw it very much in the Bush administration, that we are going to impose decisions based on ideology rather than facts on the ground, on what we want to see rather than what is. And when you do that, when the decision maker either doesn't want to hear other views or they're blocked from getting to him, that you're preordained for failure. And so I think you're exactly right.
Thank you, Jeff. And David, on the same question of is it ever possible to impose cultural and political change on any community from above, in a sense? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose again, once again, I would come at it from just a bit obliquely, and this is a comment I already made last night to the senator and to yourself, and you both have thoughts, so please come back. But I mean, it does strike me that part of the futility, the apparent, the evident futility of the venture is tied up with the United States' pre-existing relations with Pakistan. And getting back to Tamás's comment about sort of the end of the Cold War, it seems to me, and please feel free to correct or disagree, that it seems to me that the intervention in Afghanistan required a sort of fundamental reevaluation of certain relationships in the region which were never adequately revised. And so we had ties to Pakistan which thwarted in a variety of complicated ways, thwarted our efforts in the neighboring country to introduce the changes we sought to introduce.
Well, Pakistan is, Pakistan is Pakistan first. They were in a difficult position, and they didn't step up heroically and join the United States and help us win the war. And I guess, was that realistic to expect them to? And have all of a sudden terrorists start blowing up the Prime Minister of Pakistan and for selling out to the great Satan? I mean, it was not a great relationship. You're right, there was not a firm commitment from Pakistan before the thing started. And Pakistan was with us in the long Cold War battles and struggle, and so Turkey, and so you hate to lose great nations like that, fall out of the U.S., the Western orbit completely. So anyway, it was a very difficult position to be in, and people had different opinions about what to do about Pakistan to insist that they do better, and it never seemed to work.
Could I perhaps add a question which brings it back to the original question? Could our failure early on to derive the sort of concessions or support, what have you, from Pakistan, could that in a sense have confirmed for us that perhaps the imposition of our will in Afghanistan was doomed to failure too? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's a sign of...
Yeah, well, I think, I'm not sure how much we listened to Pakistan. I think France and the UK rejected Italy's concern about Libya. Libya said, don't do this. I mean, Italy said, don't do this. And I think Italy was right. Secretary of Defense Gates opposed. The majority of the National Security Council apparently opposed Libya, but they did it anyway. And so I think, so listening to people in the region who know the region and have different views would be a good step.
Thank you. And Tamás, from a geopolitical perspective, what do you make of these questions around, in a sense, cultural or political economic imperialism, I suppose, is one way of framing it. I don't know if even that's a fair way to frame it, but what are your views on it?
What I see is that it's basically what all of you have been saying, but what you've mentioned before is that we tend, from a Western perspective, they tend to not understand other parts of the world. Or, as Jeffrey pointed out, we tend to ignore some of the things that are on the ground. And from a cultural perspective, the 21st century is also a time when culture, as in a civilizational term, becomes more and more relevant. With the rise of globalization, of course. As all the other continents, all the other countries start to look even more and more similar to each other, people start to look into what are the things that make us different. And kids are having tablets in the school in Islamabad and in Dakar, and we can see skyscrapers everywhere, but culture is something that can be different. And when we try to force
Culture can be what?
Culture can be one, it can be...
You said, I just misunderstood what you said. Culture can be limited or?
Can be different.
Different.
Culture can be something we can use to express our differences. And when the United States tries to export ideas, it can. Modernity, infrastructure, hospitals, ways of living can be exported. Ideas and values cannot, because they are alien to those people, and the more we try to force them, the more they are trying to alienate themselves from it. So yes, in a globalized world, we need to focus on the cultural differences and the way it has become even more valuable to different communities.
Maybe David, who's written on the early Christian church, he's got a good book out on Pontius Pilate and read original document.
Yeah, just as a way of summing up.
Some say that we underestimate the governments of the world underestimate the power of religion in matters. Do you think that's true?
I absolutely think that's true.
So what was it? The Taliban wins and the government-supported troops with all the ammunition lose in short order. Did the religious fidelity of the Taliban people give them added strength and vigor, their united vision?
There's an interesting quote on that from Max Hastings, the British journalist and historian. He recently wrote a history of the Vietnam War. And he said the reason the North Vietnamese won, he said, was because they were Vietnamese. It's because they had an investment in being there, and that's why, and the occupying forces did not. And it's just simply, if you are that thing, it is everything to you, and that will always give you that extra momentum and that extra willingness to sacrifice. The North Vietnamese did not get demoralized, whereas the American soldiers became demoralized because they were far from home.
Yeah, but the
Not quite
question is that
religious, but
they had a religion, communism. So,
And I do believe, I mean, even in the history of World War I, about which Max Hastings would have quite a bit to say, I mean, Islam was a potent force, right, in the history of World War I. And so I do think that there was, in the middle centuries of the 20th century, in Egypt and so on and so forth, I mean, I do think that there was a strategic miscalculation, which, please correct me, but could perhaps even be seen going back to the funding of the Taliban in the last years and decades of Cold War, that has come back to haunt us.
It does often seem that when we try and solve a problem of today, we do it by shortchanging the future. You know, we almost take something from the future to fit. So we create problems for the future by a shortcut to solve today. So the US funded, you know, the Mujahideen, which led to the Taliban, and then we're fighting the Taliban. But all this actually, unless anyone else has a comment on this theme, it actually links to the third and really final question for the discussion. Does anyone else have a comment on that? No? Okay, so this actually is pivoting from what the mention of communism and actually linking back to something Tamás said earlier about where the West in the, was it Wallerstein? You were saying in 1991, he said it was the age of Pax Americana ended with the Cold War, and the loss of something to define yourself in opposition to. And I think this really gets to a real problem that's underlying a lot of the discussions of Afghanistan. And I think through this we can open it up to a discussion of the broader crises we're seeing in Western culture right now. You know, pick your crisis. You can see it from all different political sides of the spectrum. Everyone believes there is a crisis. But the thing is that in the past, you know, I've always felt that over the political spectrum, you know, the center-left and center-right disagree on solutions, whereas the far-left and far-right disagree on what the problem is they're trying to solve. And it seems to me that in the culture today, we're facing a loss of a sense of common problems or common understanding of what the problem is. And during the Cold War, in the West at least agreed the problem was communism. The question was, how do you solve it? Post-war, in the area of Pax Americana in the 90s, the end of history, people agreed that the goal was, the problem was the need to perfect the Pax Americana world. The question was, how do you get there? But it seems in the last 10 years since the financial crisis and all the crises really we've seen in the last 10 years, that we're facing a challenge not so much of defining what the solution is, but really working out what is the problem we're trying to solve. So the question I have for the panel is it fair to say that the problem we face today is not so much finding the solutions, but defining the problems we are actually trying to solve?
let somebody else start.
Come on.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Just drop it on you. Yeah.
Okay. I was thinking about what you said, that yes, I think we are more divided than we were, let's say, 10 years ago. And what I see is that, especially in America, people tend to categorize their opinions. They tend to put themselves in a little box that's called left or right, and just agree with every opinion of their preferred tribe or side. You know, like if you're left, you have to agree with abortion, intersectionality, or environment protection. If you're right, it's usually the other things. You have to be pro-gun, pro-free speech, pro-whatever. This has two reasons, I believe. One is certain political and corporate interests that benefit from people having extreme opinions, not extreme opinions, but very far from each other. And the other one is big tech. With the internet and technology, we all have created this sort of echo chambers around us, and we don't really hear any other dissenting opinions, just the same ones over and over and over again, and we don't really think about the other side, and we can't see what truth their opinions might hold. So I think if we really want to talk about the suitable questions, the suitable problems we need to find answers to, we have to start to have some kind of communications that can go over these kind of echo chambers that technology and these special interests in politics have created for us.
Thank you. I might just go to Jeff about you're interested in the rule of law, I think, in the context of these sorts of issues. What role do you think, particularly in the US, do you think the rule of law can play, or the legal system can play around these issues, I suppose, of polarity? I mean, big tech obviously is having a huge impact on the way that we communicate and indeed how we relate to each other now. And there's a lot of debates now around whether big tech should be censoring people with views that are not the flavor of whoever is running the companies. And so what would your views be on how you deal with that, and what role would the law have?
It's very difficult to deal with that. In the Cold War era, where we both came from, there was left and there was right, but there was also a broad consensus on the rule of law, on the primacy of the Constitution. There were traditions. When an election is won or lost, the loser concedes and the winner wins. And the left and right will coalesce around that government, whether they oppose it or agree with it. They don't question its legitimacy. But we've entered an era, it seems, and you were very much at the center of this, you would know this much better than I, that the facts that we that we believe in may not be facts at all. They may be fantasies, they may be conspiratorial ideas. They come from, as Tamás said, an echo chamber of internet sites, of mailing lists, of discussion boards, and with the concomitant loss of authority, both of the courts, of the mainstream media, etc., that had always governed that kind of, or governed isn't the word, that always shaped that kind of consensus on key issues. And it seems to be breaking down. That's the question really that I would have for you, because you are very much in the middle of these battles. Do you see it the same way?
A lot of different angles you could go at that, but I think, I don't know what the dividing line is. I mean, you asked that question, I'm thinking, what is the answer? For example, it seems like, just feeling in the United States, that there's this view of a great new world, and even that the current world is illegitimate, that the Constitution was founded by people, some of whom had slaves, and therefore it's not moral, and it ought to be just tossed aside. George Washington did not fix every single problem then existing in the world when they got the Constitution written, therefore it's illegitimate. I mean, that's stupid, really. It's an unrealistic understanding of history. 80 years later, they ended slavery and fulfilled the ideal that all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence. So what is the future? So we have a leftist group that really is either nihilist and some communist, some just radicals. I don't know who they are really, but they want to attack police, they want to attack tradition, they want to attack law, they don't respect. When they have riots about the police, they say are not acting wisely, but they don't want to sit down with the police like good neighbors, like the neighborhoods that are concerned, and try to find out how to make them better. They just want to get rid of the police. I mean, this is mindless. This isn't building a better world, which has to be done evolutionary in most instances. Very few revolutions work. There is an attack on the rule of law, I think, all over the world, but the United States is moving in the right direction. When I was suggested I should not recuse myself, I had just been appointed Attorney General of the United States. And I just told the Senate I was going to follow the rules. And I told the Department of Justice we were going to follow the rules and we were not going to politicize the Department of Justice. So I couldn't investigate myself or a campaign of which I had a title reported as an officer of the campaign. So you just couldn't do it. No, I couldn't. It was not conceivable that I could investigate myself and maintain any kind of credibility. So, but that was part of a determination to restore objectivity. Now the Department of Justice is a part of the President's administration. He is appointed by and serves at the pleasure of the President. And if the President wants to emphasize immigration, the Attorney General should say, yes, sir, and go out and do it or resign, one or the other. And so the President gets to set many of the policies, but he doesn't, Then the President has appointed fabulous judges. President Trump, to my view, if you're a Scalia originalist who believe judges should read the law and apply it without reference to what policy they'd like to achieve, that's what we've appointed. Now we've got 6 of those on the Supreme Court. So it's better than it was a few years ago. Now what this administration will do in 4 or 8 years, that would be wiped out. And there were 4 years of the Obama, 8 years of the Obama administration. They appointed a lot of federal judges. Most of them are lower judges that are district court and circuit court judges, but they're important. And so we've got a lot of great judges on the bench. So I think in many ways the legal system, despite all you hear about President Trump's aggressiveness on matters, being a businessman and not a lawyer, he did appoint great judges that are orthodox and traditional. So I think our legal system is better than any time, maybe, except maybe the end of the Bush administration. And what else are we fighting over, you know? We're protecting that heritage. I'm so proud that Hungary is saying, we're proud of Judeo-Christian heritage, and we're going to defend it. It doesn't apply perfectly to the United States law, but it's a perfectly legitimate thing for a nation state to decide, I think, and they defend that. And why somebody somewhere way off wants to come in and just block a lot of that is a mistake. So what is the division? Is that what the question was, right? What is the problem we're facing?
Well, I suppose actually a question...
What are the differences we have in America today?
Well, a very specific question, actually, to reframe it specifically for your particular experience, having worked in the Senate for so long, is, I mean, you joined the Senate in 1997, I guess January 97, and you left in 2017, 16. And I suppose the question specifically would be, Did you see in that time rising partisanship of knowledge between your colleagues?
Knowledge?
In terms of the frame of reference, the basic facts they agreed on. I mean, did you feel there was a sense of commonality in 1997 that then eroded, or is that, or not? Is there still a collegiality among in the Senate? And if there isn't, I mean, certainly from the outside, it looks like there are incredible divisions. There used to seem to be more friends who disagreed, and now they don't seem friends in terms of the people within the Senate, and it's and the U.S. Congress in general. And do you think that's true? And if it is, it may not be. What do you think the solution is to find again a common sense of being an American?
I don't think things are as bad as they say. That's conventional wisdom. Oh, they all hate each other now. And used to be we were so wonderful and we got along and we could have a drink and we could make a deal and everything, we went home friendly. But I had one senior, actually, he was a senator who was appointed when President Biden became vice president, and he had been Biden's chief counsel. He was teaching at a major university. And he and I were talking about it, and he said, well, I'll just tell you, back when Senator Biden started and I was his staffer, there were colossal hatreds in the Senate. People, felt they hated each other. I don't think there are any deep hatreds in the Senate. What's happening is the 24-hour news cycle, and I think as Orbán was saying, you get tribalized by the news. You on this team, you defend everything they do, and the other team defends everything they do. And then you try to win the votes of the people, and it has ratcheted up. I believe there's far too little principle, far too little adherence to rules properly. Rules make a difference. I remember when Senator from Maryland retired a few years ago and recently died, Jewish senator, but he opposed the filibustering, changing the rules of the Senate to filibuster. And it was a deal. It had never really been done before. And so a majority, by appealing the ruling of the chair, could overrule 100 years of Senate rules instead of 2/3, which the Senate rules say when you change a rule. And so they came up with this device to change the Senate rules. And he said, and I won't forget this, I won't forget it, if a majority can change the rules, there are no rules. And he opposed it. He was retiring. He was the only Democrat that opposed it. Because they decided to achieve a goal, they had to change the rules, and they changed the rules to achieve their political ends. Now, I think that's dangerous. So I think the Republicans are a little better, but they're guilty too sometimes. But I think more Republicans are principled on those kind of things. But still, it's that's a dangerous trend. If policy goals and power is the only thing that is important to you, and you're not concerned that 20 years from later somebody uses this rule to accomplish some horrible end, contrary to the way the system was set up. So what I do feel like that's a big. So the Democrats and the progressives and the radicals want judges to advance an agenda they can't win at the ballot box through judicial rulings. They want to alter the fundamentals of the country. They want to denigrate police and law enforcement. And they have theories of that create racial conflict and disharmony rather than creating harmony, and it's part of the leftist agenda. I guess you see it here in Europe. And so I think that's a big difference. I don't know what kind of differences we have on foreign policy. I can't even tell you.
It's interesting, actually, that comment about the encroachment of the judiciary on on what should be a political decisions of the legislature. Lord Sumption in the UK recently gave the Wreath lectures and he's a former Supreme Court justice, and the theme of his lectures was the slow encroachment of judges into territory that should be left to Parliament, essentially, and the erosion of political electoral decision-making and farming it out to experts. So it seems to be a problem here too. Just moving to David, I mean,
Well, Europe has a greater tradition of judges wading into political policy issues. The United States has beaten that back, and right now we made some progress. But in our system, the Constitution, Supreme law of the land, judges are supposed to follow it, whether they like it or not, and they should hear the arguments and rule on the law. And if there's a policy that needs to be accomplished, blame it on the politicians for not doing it. That's what the system is supposed to be. And they get lifetime appointments. You can't even cut their pay, Roger. And they whine about being independent. Our independence is threatened. They can't be fired as long as they live. They can't have their pay cut. They can't be eliminated. And so they're independent as you can be. And if they're so weak they can't stand up to the New York Times, then they're in the wrong business. So I do think that the judiciary has got to stay within its role because it goes against democracy. They are not accountable. They can't be removed from office for bad decisions. So their only role is to decide disputes. As Justice Roberts said, and I think I suggested it to him at his hearing, is to be an umpire, a neutral umpire, and call the balls and strikes, not taking sides in the game. That's what they're supposed to do. And we got to, Roger Pylon here's done some great work recording all the recent decisions of the Supreme Court. Every one of them he studies and responds to. But a lot of work has been done on that, and I do think that that threat can be. We've made progress against that threat, but who knows? What do you think? 4 more years of activist judges, we call them. A lot of that progress will be wiped out. But the Supreme Court looks 6 justices. It might be good for a while. Out of 9.
Turning to David, and then we'll wrap up the panel and open up to questions for about 15 minutes, or longer if you wish. There's an interesting theme before about this sort of tension between, we've lost authorities in all senses of the word, and authorities have been replaced by authors. Everyone is now their own authority on everything, and I don't know if I'm slightly dropping that on you as a question.
Well, he's an author.
Well, exactly. So, as an author, what do you think?
Well, if I may refuse to answer
that's
that question.
fine. Please go for it.
No, my only contribution, in a sense, it's very, very obvious, and I assume everyone will find it uncontroversial. I suppose in a longer perspective, thinking in terms of centuries and decades, I do believe that de-Christianization, within which I very much believe a loss, a transformation and a weakening of the Judaic tradition in both Europe and the United States. I include this within the term de-Christianization. The numbers are in the Pew Research and so on and so forth. It's a pretty drastic picture throughout Western Europe and the United States. And getting back to the question of the anthropology of ourselves.
Well, but on that question, de-Christianization also reduces a culture's commitment to truth and fidelity to law, almost. You end up with people whose religion is power and politics, in which case you use anything to gain power, which the communists always did, still do. They're liars. They do whatever it takes to advance their power. That's harder to do in the Western civilization Christian culture. Would you?
I agree. The idea that there are, there are lasting imperatives which override positive law and the changes of politics and the political struggle and so on and so forth. This idea that you might have to suffer to do something you believe is simply right, as you were just discussing. I do think that this is, in many ways, a religious sensibility. And I would say the catastrophic decline of the religion which has informed the legal and the political cultures of Europe and the United States in my generation, the next couple of generations, is going to impact us in ways that we still find it very hard to predict.
Well, thank you. Are there any other comments from the panel? Jeff?
No.
Tamás? All right, well, that really wraps up all the questions I could think of, but I'm just going to open it up now to any questions you may have for any of the panelists.